They say power can be inherited, but for some, it must be earned in blood, loyalty, and fate. And no story in Ottoman history captures that truth more deeply than that of Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha, a man who rose from the chains of slavery to sit at the right hand of one of history's greatest emperors. No one could have predicted his destiny. Born in the small coastal town of Parga, in what is now Greece, Ibrahim was just another young boy when fate struck. Captured by Ottoman soldiers during a raid, he was sold into slavery, another nameless soul in the empire's vast machinery. Yet even in captivity, something about him stood out. His intelligence, his calm presence, his ability to adapt, all made him different from the rest. He was sent to the household of Hurrem Sultan, the beloved sister of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. There, as a personal servant, Ibrahim began to learn the refined ways of palace life, reading, writing, music, and the fine art of diplomacy. But his greatest turning point came when Suleiman, still a young prince, noticed him. It was an instant bond, two young men from different worlds, yet both driven by the same hunger for greatness. Suleiman saw in Ibrahim not just a servant, but a friend, a kindred spirit. He freed him, gave him education, and brought him into his closest circle. And when Suleiman became sultan, Ibrahim was right beside him, no longer a slave, but his most trusted companion. The empire watched in disbelief as this once enslaved man rose higher and higher through the ranks. First as chief falconer, then as master of the palace, and finally, in a move that shocked the entire court, Grand Vizier, the second most powerful position in the empire. In just a few years, Ibrahim Pasha went from being property to being power. He now signed documents on behalf of the Sultan. Ambassadors bowed before him. His words could make or break kingdoms. To the outside world, it seemed as if Suleiman had given him half his throne, and in some ways, he had. But Ibrahim never forgot where he came from. Unlike the arrogant nobles who surrounded him, he treated others with respect. He spoke softly, yet his confidence commanded attention. In him, the foreign ambassadors saw a man of Europe's own kind, cultured, diplomatic, almost too sophisticated for the Ottoman court. That was both his strength and the beginning of his danger. Ibrahim began to style himself with grandeur never seen before in a vizier. His palaces rivaled the sultan's. His clothes sparkled with jewels. He even adopted the title Saraska Sultan, a name that made many uneasy, for it implied equality with Suleiman himself. But the sultan didn't seem to mind. To him, Ibrahim was family. He had given his sister, Hurrem Sultan, to Ibrahim in marriage, a gesture of trust so deep, it sealed their bond forever. Suleiman would dine with Ibrahim, laugh with him, and seek his advice on every matter of war and peace. The two were inseparable, like brothers bound by fate. Together, they reshaped the Ottoman Empire. Under their leadership, the empire expanded across Europe and the Mediterranean. Ibrahim led grand campaigns into Hungary, negotiated treaties with France, and made the name of the Ottomans feared and respected across the world. The palace chroniclers began to whisper that Suleiman trusted no one more than Ibrahim. Some even said the Sultan could not make a single decision without consulting him. It was as if the empire had two rulers, one born to power, the other chosen by it. But in the shadows of that friendship, jealousy began to grow. The court nobles resented Ibrahim's influence. The religious scholars saw his European manners as dangerous. And deep within the harem, Hurrem Sultan, Suleiman's ambitious wife, recognized Ibrahim as the greatest threat to her own rise. For now, though, Ibrahim was untouchable. His brilliance and loyalty had made him indispensable. He built bridges, not just between cities, but between cultures, a man of peace in an age of conquest. Every night, as the candles flickered in his marble halls, Ibrahim must have wondered how far he had come, and how far he still could go. A slave had become the empire's heartbeat. A foreigner had become its face to the world. Yet, in the empire of Suleiman the Magnificent, power was both a gift and a curse. And for Ibrahim Pasha, the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. He could not have known that the same hand that once freed him would one day sign his death warrant. When the sun of the Ottoman Empire rose higher than ever before, two men stood at its center, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha. It was an era historians would later call the Golden Age, when art, architecture, law, and conquest all flourished under their shared vision. The bond between these two men was more than friendship, it was brotherhood forged in destiny. Where others saw hierarchy, they saw trust. Suleiman ruled the empire, but Ibrahim managed it. Together, they created a balance so perfect that even the winds of politics dared not disturb it. Every decision of the empire, every treaty, every campaign, had Ibrahim's touch. He became the Sultan's voice in the council, his hand in diplomacy, and his shadow on the battlefield. When Suleiman's armies marched west, it was Ibrahim who led them. When emissaries from Venice or France came to Istanbul, it was Ibrahim who received them, dazzling them with his intelligence and grace. Under Ibrahim's leadership, the Ottoman Empire was no longer just feared, it was respected. He understood Europe like no one else in the court. He spoke Latin, appreciated Renaissance art, and had the rare ability to merge Ottoman strength with European sophistication. For the first time, foreign powers began to see the Ottomans not as invaders, but as equals in civilization. In 1529, when the empire marched toward Vienna, it was Ibrahim who commanded the armies. His strategies stretched across continents, from the Balkans to the Mediterranean. Even though the siege of Vienna failed, it announced to the world that the Ottomans had reached the very heart of Europe. And Ibrahim's name became legend, the soldier-scholar who led the Sultan's dream. When he returned to Istanbul, Suleiman welcomed him not as a subject, but as a brother returning home. The palace erupted in celebrations. Poets wrote verses about their friendship, calling it a light that illuminated the empire. The people adored Ibrahim. The humble vizier who rose from nothing yet carried himself with the dignity of a king. But Ibrahim was not only a statesman or a general, he was also a builder of beauty. He envisioned Istanbul not just as a capital of power, but of art and knowledge. He constructed the Ibrahim Pasha Palace, a marvel of marble and gardens that overlooked the hippodrome. Inside, scholars debated philosophy, artists painted, and musicians played under candlelight. The palace became a symbol that even in a world of war, there was room for elegance and thought. Suleiman and Ibrahim often dined together in private, discussing philosophy, poetry, and the fate of empires. Their minds complemented each other, one a ruler by birth, the other a ruler by intellect. And yet, as bright as this golden age was, its glow began to cast long shadows. The very success of Ibrahim Pasha began to breed envy. The court officials whispered that the Grand Vizier was becoming too powerful, that he carried himself like an equal to the Sultan. Some pointed out his lavish lifestyle, his European-style clothes, and his growing pride. In their eyes, Ibrahim was no longer the loyal friend, he was becoming a rival. Suleiman, however, ignored the whispers. His loyalty to Ibrahim was unshakable. He trusted him more than his own blood. Even when Ibrahim made bold moves, like signing official letters with his own seal next to the Sultan's, Suleiman chose to look the other way. To the world, it seemed like the empire had two rulers. But nowhere was Ibrahim's power more visible than in diplomacy. He orchestrated one of the most important alliances of the 16th century, a friendship with Francis I of France against the Habsburg Empire. This was unprecedented, a Muslim empire forming a strategic bond with a Christian kingdom. It was Ibrahim's brilliance that made it possible. Even European kings wrote to him directly, addressing him as the true master of the Ottoman Empire. Within the palace, though, others saw arrogance where Suleiman saw genius. The religious scholars disapproved of Ibrahim's fascination with the West. The Janissaries grumbled about his wealth. And inside the imperial harem, Hurrem Sultan, Suleiman's intelligent and ambitious wife, watched closely. She knew Ibrahim's influence over the Sultan was stronger than anyone else's, and that meant danger for her own position. Still, Ibrahim remained confident. He believed that his loyalty spoke for itself, that his years of service and victories had secured his place forever. He could not imagine that the very hands that had lifted him up could one day let him fall. But subtle changes had already begun. Suleiman was now maturing as a ruler. His love for Hurrem was growing stronger. His responsibilities as both a king and a caliph were deepening. And slowly, the Sultan began to rely less on friendship and more on control. Ibrahim, perhaps blinded by trust, didn't see the shift. He continued to live grandly, hosting banquets that rivaled royal feasts, building monuments with his name inscribed beside the Sultan's, and carrying himself with the confidence of a man untouchable. And yet, history teaches us, in the Ottoman court, no one was ever untouchable. For now, though, this was still the empire's golden hour. Two men, a sultan and his once enslaved brother in spirit, stood at the peak of power, shaping the destiny of half the world. But in the stillness behind their triumph, the seeds of jealousy, fear, and betrayal were already being sown. And soon, the world would see how even the brightest friendship can become the darkest tragedy. The golden friendship that once lit the Ottoman Empire now began to flicker. Behind the shimmering walls of Topkapi Palace, whispers turned into warnings, and warnings into quiet plots. For years, Ibrahim Pasha had been untouchable. But power, in the Ottoman court, was never a permanent gift. It was a dangerous loan, one that could be taken back at any time. As the empire grew larger, so did the distance between Suleiman and his trusted friend. Ibrahim had been with him since youth, a confidant who understood his thoughts before they were spoken. But now, Suleiman was a father, a husband, a caliph, and a ruler of an empire so vast it stretched beyond his own imagination. His responsibilities had changed, and so had his priorities. At the heart of this growing divide stood Hurrem Sultan, the woman who had captured Suleiman's soul. Hurrem was no ordinary consort. She was intelligent, calculating, and fiercely loyal to her children's future. She watched how Ibrahim commanded armies, ruled meetings, and made decisions with the confidence of a second ruler. To her, Ibrahim was a threat, not just to her influence, but to the future of her sons. Whispers began to rise in the Hurrem, the Grand Vizier thinks himself a sultan. Hurrem did not need to spread lies, she only had to repeat the truth others already saw. Ibrahim's palace, larger than most royal homes, his feasts, filled with foreign diplomats and nobles, his robes, woven with threads of gold. All of it painted the image of a man whose pride had risen higher than his rank. Suleiman, for a time, ignored the murmurs. But even he began to notice small signs, the way Ibrahim would sign decrees with his own emblem, the way European envoys spoke of him as the real ruler of the East. And perhaps, deep within Suleiman's heart, a shadow of doubt began to form. Had his dearest friend forgotten who held the divine right to rule? And meanwhile, in the corridors of power, Ibrahim's enemies multiplied. The Janissaries, proud and powerful soldiers of the empire, had grown restless. They resented the Grand Vizier's growing influence and his closeness to the Sultan. The religious scholars, ulama, disapproved of his fascination with European customs, calling it arrogance that mocked the modesty of the Prophet's followers. Even foreign spies, sent by Venice and Persia, fed stories into the Sultan's ear that Ibrahim had made secret pacts for his own gain. But Ibrahim was too confident to sense the trap closing around him. He believed his loyalty to Suleiman was unshakable, and that no whisper could break a bond forged over decades. In his mind, loyalty outweighed suspicion. But in the world of empires, trust was fragile and easily shattered by fear. One fateful night, the tension became visible to all. During a royal banquet, attended by the empire's elite, Ibrahim sat beside Suleiman, his equal in manner and speech. When foreign ambassadors toasted to the two rulers of the Ottoman Empire, Ibrahim smiled, and Suleiman remained silent. It was a moment that froze the room, the kind of silence that says more than any words ever could. From that night onward, their friendship was never the same. Hurrem Sultan saw the shift and acted with precision. She reminded Suleiman of the laws of the Prophet, that pride leads even the mightiest to downfall. She spoke softly, never accusing, only advising. She questioned whether Ibrahim's heart still served the throne or his own ambition. Suleiman listened, and though he said nothing, her words stayed with him. Meanwhile, Ibrahim continued to push the boundaries of power. He attended diplomatic meetings without the Sultan's presence, negotiated directly with foreign kings, and even referred to himself as Saraska Sultan, the Sultan of the army. He did not mean disrespect. In his mind, he was serving his master faithfully. But to those watching, it looked like the beginning of treason. The symbolism became impossible to ignore. In art, in ceremonies, in conversation, Ibrahim's name stood beside Suleiman's. And while the Grand Vizier thought of it as a tribute, others whispered that he was claiming equality. Suleiman, the most powerful man in the world, began to feel powerless in his own court. The empire he built with Ibrahim was still thriving, but their friendship was now poisoned with politics. The one man he once trusted more than his own blood had become a question mark in his mind. And in the silence of his private chambers, Suleiman wrestled with two voices, one whispering loyalty, the other warning betrayal. Outside those walls, Hurrem's influence deepened. She surrounded the Sultan with advisors who echoed her fears. She reminded him of the fragile nature of empires, of how one man's arrogance could undo generations of glory. Her words found fertile ground in a heart already burdened by responsibility. As months passed, Suleiman's affection turned to distance. Ibrahim noticed it, the colder tone, the shorter conversations, the absence of laughter they once shared. He tried to rebuild the bridge, through loyalty, through gestures, through service, but the damage was done. The empire no longer saw him as the hero of the Golden Age. It saw him as a shadow too large to ignore. In 1536, Ibrahim Pasha stood at the peak of his influence and on the edge of his destruction. The empire still bowed to his authority, yet the ground beneath him had already begun to crumble. He had risen higher than anyone born without noble blood could ever dream. But every rise in Ottoman history came with a fall, and Ibrahim's was written in whispers long before it was written in blood. Soon, the Sultan would make a decision that history would remember forever. A decision that would turn love into loss, friendship into tragedy, and the Golden Age into a warning carved in stone. The golden light of Suleiman's reign was beginning to dim, though few dared to admit it. Inside the Topkapi Palace, whispers had replaced music, and suspicion hung in the air like a storm about to break. For years, Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha had been untouchable, the Sultan's brother-in-law, his most trusted Grand Vizier, the man who carried the empire's seal of power. But with every victory he claimed, every jewel he added to his mansion, and every royal privilege he adopted, his shadow began to stretch dangerously long, even over the Sultan himself. It wasn't one act that doomed Ibrahim. It was a series of moments, subtle, almost invisible, that began to make even the calm-hearted Suleiman uneasy. The court's elite had long feared the bond between the Sultan and his vizier. They whispered, no one man should stand so close to the throne. Ibrahim's arrogance had grown with his power. He called himself Saraska Sultan, the Sultan of the army, and in public ceremonies, he often wore robes almost identical to Suleiman's, blurring the divine line between ruler and servant. For the Sultan, whose authority was absolute and sacred, this was not just boldness. It was a dangerous kind of pride. But pride was only the surface. The deeper betrayal came from trust being poisoned. Hurrem Sultan, sharp, calculating, and deeply loyal to Suleiman, saw Ibrahim as the greatest obstacle to her own influence. She understood his ambitions better than anyone. To her, Ibrahim wasn't a loyal brother-in-law, he was a serpent coiled too close to the heart of power. Slowly, she began to weave a web of doubt in Suleiman's mind, not through accusations, but through questions that lingered like smoke. "My lord," she might whisper softly, "have you ever wondered what your Grand Vizier would do if the throne were empty?" At first, Suleiman brushed it off. But Hurrem was patient. She never demanded, she only suggested. When reports arrived that Ibrahim was negotiating treaties with foreign rulers under his own name, as if he were a sovereign himself, Suleiman began to wonder if he had created a rival instead of a servant. The seeds of doubt that Hurrem had planted began to take root. And then came the final crack, a betrayal not of politics, but of faith. Ibrahim had insulted the Ottoman religious scholars, calling their rulings unnecessary chains on progress. For an empire that saw itself as the defender of Islam, this was no small offense. Rumors spread that Ibrahim had become arrogant toward Allah himself, calling his own fate his creation. The ulama, the religious council, turned against him. And when the spiritual legitimacy of a man is questioned, even the Sultan cannot stand by him for long. The final days of Ibrahim were filled with eerie calm. He still dined with Suleiman, still smiled as if nothing had changed. But those closest to him felt it, the quiet tension, the absence of laughter, the cold politeness of a sultan whose heart had begun to harden. One night, Hurrem stood by a window, watching the palace lamps flicker in the wind. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that the chessboard she had set in motion was about to claim its most powerful piece. When Ibrahim was invited to dine privately with the Sultan, he saw it as a gesture of reconciliation, a chance to mend what was broken. He walked through the dim corridors of the palace, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. He wore his finest robes, unaware that this was the last time he would ever wear them. As the doors closed behind him, the shadows of the room swallowed him whole. The Sultan's face was unreadable. They spoke of the past, of battles, of victories, of the empire they had built side by side. But beneath the words, an invisible wall had risen. Suleiman looked at his friend, the man who had once been closer to him than a brother, and saw only the ghost of loyalty lost. The dinner ended, the wine was poured, and Ibrahim was led quietly to his chamber to rest. That night, under the veil of darkness, the order was given. The guards entered silently, their faces hidden. There was no trial, no public humiliation, only the quiet fulfillment of imperial command. Ibrahim Pasha, the once glorious Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, was strangled with a silk cord, as was the custom for nobles. It was said that when the guards entered, he did not resist, he only looked up and said softly, "The Sultan's will is Allah's will." When morning came, the empire awoke to silence. No bells rang. No drums announced the death. The man who had carried the empire's fate for years was gone, erased from the pages of the living. In the cold halls of Topkapi, Suleiman sat alone, his pen trembling as he wrote a single line in his diary, "I have lost my sleep." The breaking point had come not through swords or armies, but through silence, suspicion, and shadows. The empire had survived, but something inside Suleiman had died that night, the part of him that still believed in friendship above power. The morning after Ibrahim Pasha's execution, the air over Istanbul hung thick with disbelief. Word traveled slowly but with the weight of thunder, the Grand Vizier, the most powerful man after the Sultan himself, had been executed in the night. The empire, which had once celebrated Ibrahim as the architect of Ottoman glory, now whispered his name only behind closed doors. His mansion stood eerily quiet, his tapestries were removed, and his portraits burned. To the court, he was a traitor, to the streets, a mystery, and to Suleiman, a wound that would never heal. In the quiet loneliness of his private chambers, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent sat in silence. The man who once called Ibrahim my brother now faced the cost of absolute power. Every ruler knows that loyalty can be both a weapon and a weakness, and for Suleiman, that truth had come at an unbearable price. He had not just lost his vizier, he had executed the memory of his youth, his companionship, and the only man who had ever dared to speak to him as an equal. Some chroniclers say that in the weeks following Ibrahim's death, Suleiman barely spoke. His poetry, once filled with metaphors of love and conquest, turned somber and introspective. In one of his verses, he wrote, "Kingship is a burden none can share. And hearts once trusted turned to despair." To the people, it seemed that the Sultan had rid himself of a dangerous rival. But those close to him knew better, they saw a man haunted by what his throne demanded. Hurrem Sultan's influence grew stronger, her sons rose in prominence, and the palace resumed its glittering routines. Yet under all that magnificence, the ghost of Ibrahim Pasha lingered, a reminder that even in the most powerful empire on earth, trust could become a death sentence. Years later, when foreign envoys visited Suleiman, they often remarked on his eyes, the eyes of a man who has seen too much. The Sultan never publicly spoke of Ibrahim again. But there were small gestures. Quiet signs of lingering remorse. He ensured that Ibrahim's family was not disgraced, his properties were not entirely confiscated, and his name, though forbidden from praise, was not erased from official records. It was Suleiman's silent way of making peace with his past, or at least pretending to. The empire, however, learned a colder lesson. Ibrahim's death changed the structure of Ottoman politics forever. No Grand Vizier would ever again rise to such unchecked power. The Sultan's trust would forever come with conditions, loyalty, yes, but never equality. Ministers would serve with fear, not affection, knowing that the throne's favor was as temporary as the candlelight in the palace halls. Historians later debated Ibrahim's downfall. Was he truly plotting against the Sultan, or was he simply a victim of palace intrigue? Some painted him as arrogant, a man who forgot his place in the shadow of greatness. Others called him a visionary ahead of his time, one who dreamed of a more independent and modern empire, where intellect mattered more than lineage. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. But perhaps the most tragic truth is this: Ibrahim's fall was not just about betrayal or ambition, it was about the cost of proximity to absolute power. In the Ottoman world, to be loved by the Sultan was to stand in sunlight so bright that it could burn. Ibrahim Pasha soared higher than any man of his generation, but in the end, even his brilliance could not escape the shadow of the throne. Suleiman's reign continued for decades after that night, expanding the empire to its zenith. Yet, when his courtiers saw him gazing toward the Bosphorus in quiet reflection, they knew he was not looking at the horizon, he was looking backward, to the friend he had lost in the name of rule. And so, the legacy of Ibrahim Pasha became more than a story of betrayal. It became a symbol of loyalty turned fatal, of ambition punished by the very power it served. His rise and fall defined an era, shaping how the Ottomans viewed trust, authority, and the fine line between serving and ruling. When Suleiman finally died years later, some said he left instructions that his own tomb should face the sea, the same sea from which Ibrahim once returned victorious. Perhaps, in death, he wished to watch over the man who once shared his dreams, his victories, and his downfall. In the grand mosaic of Ottoman history, their story remains one of the most haunting. It reminds us that empires are not only built on stone and steel, but on the fragile, dangerous bond between two men who believed they could rule the world together. One as the Sultan, the other as his shadow. But in the end, even shadows cannot stand beside the sun for too long. And that was the legacy of Ibrahim Pasha, the loyal friend who rose like the moon beside the Sultan's son, only to fade when dawn arrived.